Okay. That good?
Yeah.
I think so. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Pfoutz, and today I'm going to talk to you about application pen testing. And really, this is about engaging with third parties to do that pen testing, focused on the application layer, and then how to manage that engagement. First, a little bit about myself. I've spent 12 years in information security. The last 4 of those years have been focused on application security. I kind of like to say my skills are pretty broad, but only deep in certain areas. So I am both hands-on, so I do targeted pen testing, vulnerability assessments, and then I'm also really involved in governance. And a lot of that revolves around third-party management, COTS applications, and things like that. I'm primarily blue team, so mostly working with developers, but I do have red team capabilities. So like I said, I can do point manual pen testing, although I've never done an end-to-end pen test. And this kind of goes back to what Dave Kennedy was talking about this morning, is to be able to see both sides of the equation. So if you're defending, you need to know what the attackers are doing. You need to know what your adversaries are doing in order to try to defend against it. And even as a pen tester, it's good to be able to work with those that are defending the networks and instruct them on how to properly do that. Some of my other interests as it relates to security are in the mobile space. So over the last 6 months, I've really tried to get into mobile, and especially around the application space and mobile applications. Additionally, I've gotten really involved in cloud governance, so dealing with third parties, SaaS providers, COTS providers, things like that. And I'll get into that as we go further. And actually, part of my background is doing vendor risk assessments for a large environment. And it's really interesting how when you've been on that side to flip over to the other side and kind of see how things work. There have been some eye-opening things that I'll talk about later. Personally, I have 2 kids, so the little bit of free time I have for my professional, I spend with my 2 kids. And then that small sliver of time that I have for myself, I like to mountain bike. And I also enjoy beers and bourbon, so exploring those areas. So I'd like to find out a little bit about the audience and maybe alter my talk a little bit as we go along. So what I'd like to know is how your organizations or yourself engage with third-party pen testers, particularly in the application space. Do we have any application pen testers or former application pen testers in the audience? Okay, 1. How many of your organizations have an internal application pen test capability, so your own application pen test team? Okay, only 1, okay. How many of your organizations regularly engage with application pen testers? So that means you have a pen testing schedule and you adhere to it and do it on a regular basis. 1, okay. And then how many of you engage with application pen testers on an ad hoc basis, so as needed? 2, okay. And then the rest, I'll go ahead and let you remain anonymous if you don't do application pen testing, or assume that you don't want to disclose that. So while not approved or reviewed by the companies these scenarios are associated with, the genesis of the talk is really the frustration that I faced in creating a program around application pen testing and engaging with third parties to do that. It's really hard to find reliable pen testing vendors. And a lot of that is because, number one, there's a huge demand for it now, and that demand is growing every day as there's more and more attacks against the application layer, and that the publicity around those attacks is increasing. And then the shortage of people that are able to actually perform those assessments. There's very few people in the space. So the demand for application pen testing far outweighs the supply. But there's a lot of money to be made in the business, particularly due to that imbalance. So a lot of organizations have cropped up that may not necessarily be reputable, but they got into the space just because there's a lot of money to be made there. And I'm not going to reveal the names of those organizations. There was an organization I spoke with recently, and I talked to them, and they had the way that they were managing their pen test engagements was really appealing to me, and it looked really strong. But you also need to have the technical capabilities to go along with that. And as I probed deeper and looked into who is running the organization, I noticed that it was a new company, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it was started by somebody who was primarily in sales and looking at a broad information security strategy. So my question was, where do they get the expertise to now get into this very niche market and very technical market? And that just kind of illustrates, how people are kind of crowding into the market. And then there are the companies that fucked my shit up. And I'm going to tell you sanitized and slightly altered details around some of those engagements. But due to NDAs and the fear of getting fired or sued, I'm not going to name the names of those vendors. You got to love the lawyers. And in fact, when I was giving a prior version of this talk earlier, a vendor came up to me afterwards, and they were talking to me about one of the products that they had, and didn't really say who they worked for until they gave me their business card. And they handed me their business card, and I had to have the look of death in my eyes, because some of the stories that I had told in that talk were actually about the vendor that was handing me that business card. So that was kind of interesting. So let's start out with, why do we pen test? And one of the obvious things is that vulnerability scans don't catch everything. And Dave Kennedy talked about this earlier, in that, obviously a pen test can't, or a vulnerability scan can't test business logic. So if you've got a banking application and you've got a functionality that allows you to withdraw money, and you put a negative value in there, and then all of a sudden it adds money to your account, a vulnerability scanner can't test for that. It doesn't know the business that goes behind that application. And then there's other vulnerabilities, such as horizontal and privilege escalation, that are really hard to test from an automated perspective, particularly since most of our dynamic scanners don't have, they're using one role. So how does it know what another role has access to, and try to correlate those things together? But what I've found is that automated scanning misses even the simple stuff. And just two things to talk about there. Over the last couple of years, clickjacking has become a big vulnerability, but a lot of our dynamic scanners can't test to that. And there's a very simple test in that, essentially a header is one of the primary ways to defend against that. And we can't even test for that header. And another way is JavaScript, which is a little harder to test for, but this is something that we should be able to test for. And then we had an application that was very Ajax heavy. And front and center on that page, one of the primary fields of that application, the first field you see after you log in, it had a cross-site scripting vulnerability. And it was just it didn't require any encoding or obfuscation. All it was a simple script tag and alert box. And you put that in, and all of a sudden the alert box pops up. And why didn't our dynamic scanner catch that? It should have been an easy catch. And upon further investigation, it was discovered our dynamic scanning engine isn't able to test JSON. So all of your JSON communication is not, at least using this engine, and it's an industry-leading engine, it's not discovering cross-site scripting, even just basic cross-site scripting attacks. So we need to have manual pen testers. But manual pen testing is expensive. So how do we prioritize those applications that are used for pen testing, or that we need to pen test? So how many of your organizations have applications that your clients log into or store your clients' data? Good number, probably about at least a third of the audience. Clients are starting to get and particularly with the target breach, clients are starting to get really interested in how their vendors are securing their applications and their infrastructure. So we're seeing a lot of client audits going on, and they're looking to make sure that you're pen testing your application, and even wanting to see those pen test reports. And they're putting it in their contract that you have to secure your applications properly. And here are some of the steps that you have to take in order to secure your applications. So particularly if that's in the contract, but even if your clients are using your applications or storing their sensitive information in there, you need to prioritize those applications first. And if there's a contractual requirement, you need to make sure that you are doing pen testing for those applications. Otherwise, you're going to get caught with your pants down when someone comes to question you on that and understand the security of your application. And then Dave even talked about this a little bit this morning. Before you hire a pen test, I really encourage you to make sure that you're doing dynamic and static analysis and catch that low-hanging fruit. You don't want to be paying a pen tester $250 an hour to find basic cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in your application. Those things that are low-hanging fruit that your automated testing can find. Get all of that stuff cleared up first, and then start engaging with a third-party pen testing organization. Now, the exception to that is, like I talked about earlier, is if you're using newer technologies, you're using a lot of Ajax, or your application is very complex, then you may want to engage a pen tester right from the start. But then after that, in a previous talk, I talked at length about this, and that talk is actually up on the B-Side Chicago, and I think Iron Geek recorded that, so you can look on his page to see that, where I talked about building an application security program. But you need to risk rank your applications and understand where are the jewels of your organization. So you've got high-risk applications, low-risk or medium-risk applications, and low-risk applications. And those high-risk applications typically include PII, client-sensitive information, mergers and acquisitions, financial data, things like that. And those should be the applications you should prioritize for pen testing. And then I understand budgets are limited, so when you start going down to the medium and low-risk applications, then at that point, you need to, your own organization needs to decide whether it's worth the spending to do that. And the industry standard, and this is what most of your clients will expect, is that you do annual pen testing. But as you're making changes to the application, you should begin to, after you mature out of doing annual pen testing, you should start maturing into integrating that with the SDLC. And at the very least, looking at the functionality that's changing as part of that application and having the pen tester test that stuff. So there's a few different, there's a number of people I think that are probably new to application pen testing in the audience. So this will be a good introduction here. There's a number of different approaches that we can take to application pen testing. And one of those is an approach that I have concerns with, but many of your vendors may be doing this, is to just do a dynamic scan. The pen tester will weed out the false positives, and they're going to call that a pen test. They'll provide you a report. Essentially, it's going to be the web inspector, app scam findings, copied and pasted, everything Dave said you shouldn't do, and they'll call that a pen test. So number one, if you're assessing your vendors, make sure that they aren't doing this. The next approach, and this is what I think typically consider pen testing, is that we would have a time window of approximately, oftentimes 2 weeks, where the pen tester will go in, they'll do their automated testing, and then they'll follow up with the majority of that engagement should be manual testing and understanding the application and trying to work through the workflows and break the business logic, find those things that automated scanning doesn't find, and taking those findings from the automated testing and going deeper with them. You could also take it to the next level and go exhaustive with that, where essentially you hand it over to the pen tester and they say, when I'm done with it, I'm done with it, and I'll bill you by the hour. That's really hard to budget for, so I tend to take a middle ground of saying, okay, we're going to do, let's say, a two-week pen test, 2-week time box pen test. And then if I start seeing that they're still finding findings halfway through that second week, I'll call up the pen tester and say, hey, do you need more time? And then I'll go back to whoever's paying for that pen test and say, we need a little more time. Are you able to give us the extra budget? Because we're finding a lot of stuff here and we need to keep going. Now, the other model that we've moved to over the last year is what I would call a hybrid pen test. And a lot of organizations are really sensitive about giving the pen testing organization their source code, but I think it's almost necessary because number one, the pen tester will look through the source code and they'll do a targeted source code review that's not going to be exhaustive, but they'll look at things such as authentication, authorization, input validation, and some of those functions that you have in place that are related to security and focus in on those. And then they'll go in and they'll do a normal pen test. But now if they run up against something that looks a little fishy, let's say, for a blacklist filter for cross-site scripting, then instead of having to beat against that filter and try to break through it and spend a lot of time doing that, they can just refer to the source code, see what that filter looks like, and craft an attack very quickly to get through it. So actually, you end up getting a more thorough pen test and oftentimes very little extra cost because you can get a lot more coverage in a lot less time because you're not flying blind. Now, the next two things aren't necessarily pen testing, but they're things that a lot of, particularly application security consultancies offer, and that would be a full source code review. So like I talked about before, where you do a targeted source code review, here they would do the full source code review. That tends to get very expensive, but oftentimes it's guided by your automated tools such as Fortify. And then the last thing I think is very important for your very critical applications, but it costs a lot of money, and that's to go in and do a threat model and architectural review. And if you listen to Gary McGraw or read any of his books, and he's kind of, what I would consider the father of application security. He's been doing it since before application security was really a profession. And he's written a number of books on the topic. But according to him, half of our vulnerabilities that we find in an application are related to bugs. That means the developer did the right thing, or the developer wrote the right code, but they made a mistake in how they were handling security. So they didn't sanitize their input. They didn't encode their output for cross-site scripting. They used the dynamic query when it comes to SQL injection. So those are the things that are automated tests, are standard pen testing finds. But then if you go a little deeper and you look at the underlying architecture and how that infrastructure is set up and how the application is architected, and do a threat model against that, that's where the other 50% of your issues are bugs. The other 50% of your issues are design flaws, and that's really hard to find through automated or manual pen testing. So at that point, you're starting to look through documentation and architecture. Another thing that comes up quite a bit, and it's become a hot topic, and we find it a lot in dealing with our clients, is do we pen test our application in production or UAT? Now, from an infrastructure perspective, a lot of times we test in production, but I feel like at the application layer, we really should be testing in UAT. And the reason for that is I think code is a lot different in that after the code leaves the QA environment, it's often not modified. So it's pushed either through automated processes or through the IT team into the UAT and then the production environment. So your code in staging and your code in production, if you're using a strong change control process, should look the same. Now the difference is that in the production environment, the purpose of an application pen test is to send corrupt data into the application. So you're adding fields and you are adding corrupt information into that application, which could break it. Now, one could argue that an attacker could do the same thing, but oftentimes your attacker does not have the same privileges as what you're giving the pen tester. So the problem is that in order to prevent the application from breaking, which nobody likes, even if they're contractually, if the pen tester is not responsible for the application breaking, nobody wants that to happen. So they're going to scale back their pen tests, and they're not going to go as deep, and they're not going to do some of those attacks that they may do in a staging environment. So at the end of the day, there's not really much risk in testing in the UAT environment versus the production environment, but you're getting a lot less depth. So I think when you look at that cost-benefit analysis, I really heavily lean towards testing and staging. Now, if you're still concerned about staging and production being different, you could still go really hard and full strength at your staging environment or your UAT environment, and then still do a validation on your production environment to make sure that it matches staging or your UAT environment, and then also do whatever testing is not going to be destructive there. So you can get the best of both worlds doing that. So now to get to the meat of the conversation, and this is really, really the thing that I was looking for in doing this presentation and providing back to the community here, because I was tasked with, we had an issue with one of our pen testers and we had to fire them. And I was tasked with completely rebuilding how we engage our pen testers from the ground up. And it was very critical that we get the best pen testers, because what had happened with that previous vendor is there were some obvious issues that they didn't find. And we needed to make sure that that didn't happen with the new vendor. So we needed to make sure that we had best of breed pen testing vendors. And I thought this should be easy. I'll just go to Forrester and Gartner, look at the Magic Quadrant. That's going to give me, a really good starting point. And then I can add some vendors from there and then just keep going. And I went to Forrester and there's nothing. I went to Gartner and there was nothing. And I'm like, well, Google has the answer to all questions, right? So I started Googling for information. Not really that much other than sales information. I reached out to my network. I have a pretty broad network in the security community in Chicago. And some of the responses I got back, even from people I trusted, were organizations that I had dealt with before and they had fallen down on the job. So I couldn't even trust that. And in a last-ditch effort, I checked Consumer Reports, Angie's List, still not finding anything. So I came up with my own approach, and I started out by interviewing a number of vendors. And some of the questions I asked were certifications, and me personally, I don't believe much in certifications, but other people on the team did, and so I added it to the list. And sure enough, we come back, and certifications really don't matter. I don't think any of the organizations had any set policy around certifications. And when you look at the Certified Ethical Hacker, that statement that I have there was taken straight from their website, yet they were hacked. So certifications don't matter. This one really surprised me. Price. When I went into this, what I expected is that for our most critical applications, I'm going to hire the best, no matter how much it costs. And then we're going to have a standard level pen test that's going to be significantly cheaper, and they would handle our standard application pen test. But what I found, and understand we can probably negotiate prices down off the list price oftentimes, but regardless of whether the vendor was fantastic or a fly-by-night shop that nobody had heard of, $250 an hour for a pen test. And a lot of times they're going to give you a fixed price for it, but that fixed price is come up with by multiplying the number of hours they think it's going to take to do the engagement times their bill rate. So really it all comes down to the bill rate. And the bill rate across all vendors that I looked at was $250 an hour, give or take $25. And actually what came out as the best pen tester at the end of the day was the one that was minus $25, the cheapest on the cheaper end. So price doesn't matter. So what does matter? My feeling is that when you're focusing on the application, your application pen tester needs to focus on the application. Oftentimes these organizations hire former developers, so they know the stuff that developers do. They know the stuff that developers make because they probably made those mistakes themselves. They know how to build an application, and they know how to fix an application when those vulnerabilities are found. And ultimately, they know how to talk to the developer on the same level as them. And I think really, when I think about it, when we look at the IT side of things, do you want somebody who's managing your firewalls to write your applications? And do you want somebody who's writing your applications to configure your firewalls? They're two very different skill sets. Now, I understand that there are some talented people that can cross over from one side to the other, but if the organization that you're hiring to do your application pen test is using network pen testers to do that, I don't think that that's the best approach to doing things. So how do you find organizations that focus on application pen testing? Now, I think when you look at the larger pen testing organizations, the way I started, and I'm not here to show for any vendors, so I'm not going to mention any vendor names, but if you go to the OWASP website and you look at who is contributing to OWASP projects, who's speaking at OWASP events, who is sponsoring OWASP events like AppSec USA, you'll find a number of different vendors that are very focused on the application space. Additionally, Microsoft has their secure development lifecycle, and that's a whole methodology that they've published around doing application security within your development environment. And they've partnered with a number of vendors there, and you can use that vendor list too to see organizations that really focus on the application layer. Now that leaves out a lot of smaller organizations, like for instance, Secure Ideas is I've never used Secure Ideas before, so I'm not necessarily advocating them, but Kevin Johnson wrote the curriculum for the SANS course on web app pen testing, so I have to think he probably does a good job there, but he's not mentioned on any of these sites because he's a smaller organization. Another thing that I found is a huge differentiator is if you go to your vendors and you ask them how they test a web app, they're going to come back with all the same answers, and it's going to be the right answers. They've all studied the OWASP site. It's kind of a common approach, and it's pretty easy to come up with. But when you start throwing new technologies at them, that's where you start to see the differences. For instance, like thick client applications, not that that's a new technology, but a lot of organizations that I dealt with historically, when they go in and test a thick client application, like a terminal services application, they really look at the configuration of the underlying platform as much as they can, and then they start throwing SQL injection and cross-site scripting vulnerabilities into the thick client application. That's not really going to show you much, and they're really just trying to treat a thick client application like a web application. What they should be doing is they should be able to look at the underlying, be able to monitor the underlying platform, and be able to inspect and tamper with any of that communication that's going on. And then they also need to have access to the network channel so that they can inspect at a very deep level how they can tamper with that application and tamper with the network communications and see what that communications are going on there. So oftentimes what they may ask for is either to have the binary so that they can build up their own environment in a test in their own lab environment and test the application that way, reverse engineer the application, or they'll ask for a copy of the VM that you may have stood up for that application, and then deploy those into their lab environment. Or they may ask for VPN access and server level access to your own environment, and then access to the network layer there. Now, if they're just asking for binaries, they still need to go back and make sure that in your environment all the configurations have been made correctly. So they're still going to need some access to your environment, but they really should have full access to all of the infrastructure supporting that application when they test it. Mobile was another thing. A lot of organizations that I asked pretty much said that they treat mobile just like any other application. There's really no differences there, and by and large, that's true. But the threat model is incredibly different when it comes to mobile than with a browser-based application. So if you're getting, and I'll go into performing a trial use on, or a POC on an application pen testing vendor later, but if you're doing a mobile application, an easy way to check that if you're not specialized in the application space is to go to the OWASP Mobile Top 10 and make sure that the issues that you're seeing there are some of the findings that you find in your application. And make sure that those don't cross over with the standard OWASP Top 10, that they are the mobile specific issues. And that'll give you a good indicator that they do recognize the difference in that threat model. I'm not really involved much in embedded systems, so I can't speak to that very much, but I have to presume if you're in that embedded systems environment, you may be able to understand what the differences between embedded systems and a standard app is. The other thing you want to look for in an application pen testing vendor is that they're a thought leader. This was a surprising thing that I found out in doing my interviewing. One of the questions we asked, because we were having this discussion internally, do we test in UAT or do we test in production? And so I threw that out to all the pen testers we were interviewing. And a couple of the vendors came back with, we'll do whatever you want. And that's not really what I want when I'm hiring a consultant. I want you to give me the expertise. I want you to tell me what is the best thing that I should be doing and why I should be doing it that way. The other thing is to look at your vendors and make sure that they are, like I said earlier, that contribution to OWASP projects shows a level of expertise and thought leadership. Are they speaking at AppSec USA conferences, GrrCON, Black Hat, DEF CON, DerbyCon, many of the conferences that they go on? Are they writing books? Are they writing white papers? What is their reputation within the industry and who is working for them? By the way, that book cover, I have no clue what that book's about. I just found it very amusing. You want to make sure that they're a cultural fit for your organization. One of the things, one of my thoughts is that I think the best pen testers in the industry are part of small organizations. But that may not be right if you're a large enterprise, because they may not be able to handle the volume that they're giving you. And the other thing that I found is you have to be able to have an expertise when you're dealing with a small organization, because that's also where a lot of the shysters are. So if you don't know, and if you aren't an application expert yourself, if you're looking at hiring a smaller organization, make sure you pull in an expert who is. Because like I said, I think the best professionals in the industry are in small organizations, but you really need to be careful there. You want to make sure that they support your model and your pen testing approach. And when we go back to this slide, if you are looking for a validated dynamic scan, which I don't recommend, a lot of pen testing organizations won't call that a pen test. Furthermore, if you're looking for a threat model / architecture review or full source code review, a lot of organizations don't have the capability to do that. So if that's something you're looking for, make sure that they're going to meet your model. The other thing is when we do a pen test, typically we'll do an initial test, and then we'll have like a 90-day remediation period, and then the pen tester will come back and retest those issues and then produce a report based on that second pen test. If you need 6 months to remediate those issues, some organizations won't accept that. So make sure that they're willing to go along with your model in that approach. And the biggest thing, I've talked a lot in my previous talk, I talked a lot about, even though you have, and here I talked about vulnerability scans, even though you have the best detection rates, that may not be the best tool for your organization, because if the tool doesn't fit in with your SDLC, then the developers aren't going to fix the findings. And that's really what we're going for. We're not trying to find the most issues, we're trying to fix the most issues. So from a cultural perspective, making sure that that pen tester fits in with the culture of your development organization. Now I know everybody here has projects that always run on time. They're always on budget, and when they start the project and they say they're going to deploy on this date, that always happens, right? Yeah. No, not really. So especially if you're an organization that misses that date more than it makes that date, you want to make sure that your pen tester can maybe come in on short notice. So as you get closer to that deployment date, you can pin down that date more. Or you want to make sure that if that date changes, that they're not going to penalize you 100% of fees to reschedule that date. And I don't think any organization will penalize 100% of fees, but there typically will be a penalty there. So make sure that that lead time that they need matches your organization, and make sure that their rescheduling policy matches what you can financially manage. So we've talked about all these things. We've interviewed the vendor. We understand their policies. We understand their processes. But the proof is really in the pudding. We can talk about it all we want. So what I recommend is taking all the vendors that have passed that interview process and put them through a POC or a trial run. Give them all one application, and if you've got enough budget, give one application to multiple vendors and kind of pit them up against each other. And in fact, a lot of the global banks, even on a go-forward basis, as part of their standard pen testing processes, will give an application to multiple vendors and pit them up against each other and continuously make sure that they're trying. But I understand budgets oftentimes can't support that, except for in the most secure of institutions. But to have each vendor do a pen test and see what comes out of it. Now, these are the things you should not see, and these have all come from personal experience. So I'll start out with a story. We had an application that typically for us, it's a low-risk application. Our clients use it, but it's all aggregate data. But one of our clients wanted to use it for a specialized purpose that was going to make it high risk. And as part of that, they wanted to make sure that a pen test was done. And at the end of the pen test, they would get a high-level report to assure that that application is secure. So we had a pen testing vendor come in, and at the end of the pen testing, we had some issues because, number one, a month later, we found that they had uploaded attack tools into the application. And in this instance, we were testing production. They never informed us of that, and they never removed the attack tools. And this is an attack tool that could actually, in some instances, be considered malware. Additionally, they had uploaded unprofessional images into the production environment, and we found that out, right away. And they knew they were testing in the production environment, so make sure that that sort of thing is not being done. Pen testers, so I understand that, the technical field there tends to have a reputation for not having good communication skills, but to make sure that your pen tester has the professionalism to attend all scheduled meetings. To make sure that, and I've experienced this a lot, to make sure your pen tester is abiding by the change window that you've provided for them, the testing window that you've provided for them. So if you tell them that they can test from 9 to 5 or 9 to 7 during the business day so that India can do their UAT testing at night, make sure that they're only testing during those hours and they're not extending into the night. And that if you tell them they can test till Friday, they don't extend into the weekend. Or when you come back to them with an issue and say, can you look at, I need some more information on this. And they say, well, I'll just go back into the environment and check on it. You need to make sure that your pen testers are only in the environment when you tell them to. And that's going to tie into something that I talk about later, because if they knock something over, your network operations and your incident response team needs to be aware that they'll be aware that a pen tester was in the environment and they may be the cause of that, and they can investigate it. Where if the pen tester is not supposed to be in there and they break something, you don't know what can happen. You could send off a whole chain of events that you don't really expect to happen. So your pen tester really should be abiding by the hours that you give them. Also, your pen tester should not have a large number of obvious false positives. There is another situation where we had a pen tester come in and they pen tested, and actually this was the same engagement. So remember that the client was looking for a report very close to the end of it, and they had produced the report with 24 medium risk findings. And as I went through the report and retested those issues, I found out that 12 of them, so half of those issues, were false positives. So on one side, look at the fact that this report was going to a client, and it would look much worse than really what it should be if I hadn't filtered through those findings. And number two, our reputation to development, that if they would have seen those 24 findings and had to spend the time to go through those and maybe fix those issues when really they didn't need to, and have to spend all that time only for waste. So what are the things you should see? Number one, you should see, I tend to look up whenever I hire a pen tester and start an engagement. I'll typically get an email from the lead tester, and I'll look them up on LinkedIn, social media, whatever, and try to find out information about them, and try to find out their background. Do they have a development background? Are they fresh out of college? What is their background in it? And that'll help me understand the staff that this organization hires. And I keep note of what I'm seeing for those organizations to help understand the experience of the staff. You should be looking for unique and novel findings. So if all you see in your pen test report is the same stuff that you get out of your dynamic scanning engine, then there's probably a problem. You should be seeing novel findings. You should be seeing issues around business logic. And that's not to say every pen test should find very novel issues, but you should be seeing those on a regular basis. As part of the finding, the vendor should provide you with very clear steps on how to recreate the issue. And this provides two benefits. Number one, it provides the benefit of when the developer goes and tries to recreate that issue, they can understand why they need to fix it, because they're going to see that vulnerability exploited, and they're going to see the danger of leaving that vulnerability into the environment. So it will reinforce to them the importance of doing this, and hopefully in their future development practices, they'll remember that and not reintroduce that issue into another application. Secondly, there's a lot of value that when you need to escalate an issue, if your CIO or CISO or development manager who may not be technically inclined can go through those steps and say, oh yeah, I've just exploited that issue. That really reinforces to them, and it may even provide a full sense of urgency, but it'll give them an urgency as to why they need to fix that issue, and it's something that they can do themselves, and it kind of gives them a sense of accomplishment. The last thing is, and this kind of goes back to hiring an organization that is focused on the application. The ability to communicate on the same level as the developers. So when they're going through the findings, they can talk maybe at a code level of how to fix that stuff. That when the developer comes back to them and says, well, I can't follow the approach that you've given me, the industry best practices, because it's going to break my application, that pen tester can say, well, here's another way to fix it. So that's really important. And by the way, these LinkedIn headlines here, that was actually given as a recommendation for headlines that you should have in your LinkedIn profile. I don't know that I necessarily agree, but so the next step I'm going to go into is things in managing a pen testing engagement that you can do to save yourself effort and headaches, or will help preserve the reputation of your security organization. So number one is to have a scoping document that you've created. So I'm going to talk later about the importance of having multiple vendors that you deal with. So what I've typically done is I take together all the scoping documents, and most pen testing vendors will have a form that they use as a scoping document. Take all those documents together and create my own scoping document. And in that scoping document, I will ask for the credentials on the accounts. And then that scoping document will be provided back to whichever pen tester is managing the engagement. And if I'm doing a competitive bid, then I really only have to have one document that I can give to all of them. But I make sure I ask for the credentials during the scoping phase, because out of all of the pen tests that I've had delayed, 90% of that, or probably about 80% of the time, it's due to not having working accounts. And for those of you that work in large enterprises, you may be able to sympathize with me, because in a task that really should take about 5 minutes, and creating an account takes about 5 weeks in an enterprise environment. Number two is to have rules of engagement with that pen testing vendor. So what is the infrastructure that may be out of scope? You may have identity federation. So maybe your federation, your authentication systems may be out of scope. Maybe you are integrating with a SaaS provider on the back end as part of that application, and that SaaS provider may be out of scope. You may not want to have denial of services or brute forcing attacks as part of the scope. Define all of that in a clear rules of engagement. And some of the other things that you may want to have in your rules of engagement are, oops, went too far, are the things that I talked about before, the things that you don't want to see as part of your trial run. So yeah, rules of engagement are important. So the next thing is, and these may be obvious, but they happen more often than any of us would like to admit, and that's why it gets the Jesus face palm. is to make sure that you're informing your security monitoring and network operations team that a pen test is going on. Because, let's say that pen test kicks off on Friday afternoon and you don't monitor your email over the weekend, and the incident response team has started treating this as an incident because they didn't know about the pen test, and they've now wasted their whole weekend responding to an incident that didn't exist. It doesn't look very good. Not that that's ever happened, but also make sure you back up your systems. There was a situation that I'm aware of that this was actually an application that supported trading, like mutual fund trading. And the pen tester came in, and in this instance, they had pen tested in the production environment. Trading environments tend to be very high availability systems, and they put corrupt data into the database that just broke the database, and it was completely unrecoverable, and there was no backup. So the DBAs spent the next 2 weeks round the clock trying to fix the issue. This wasn't an organization I was part of where they had to do manual trading on the floor in order to deal with that instead of using automated systems. And the CISO spent his time buying pizzas and other meals for the DBAs on his own personal credit card and hoping he wasn't going to get fired. So make sure you always back up your systems. And I know it's you get into this mode of we've done 20 pen tests and we've never had anything fall over, but you want to make sure that it can happen. It can happen, and if it does, it can be catastrophic. One of the things that's become near and dear to my heart is managing developer relations. And this goes to really creating credibility and maintaining credibility of your security organization, and working closely with the developers to make sure that you are managing them well and giving them what they need to do their job. So number one, like I talked about before, make sure you validate your findings before you hand it off to the developer. And I'll talk a little later about having a closeout call. So you need the developers to validate the issues first. You would go through and validate the findings. So you mean, sorry, I got a little bit off track there. So validate your findings before you hand it off to the developers. That's the key point there. And then your developers may still find a couple of issues, and that's fine. I mean, you as a security person can't know everything and all of the dealings of the application, but validate, at least get those quick hits out of the way. Next, have a closeout call with the developers, and that closeout call should include the pen tester, a representative from security, and a member of the development team. And the things that should happen during that discussion are, number one, that the pen tester should talk about the findings and why they're important and how you fix the issues. And they should be talking to the developer on a developer's level. The developer should be able to ask clarifying questions and understand why that is an issue. They may come back and they may say that we can't fix this because it's going to break the application. That also could be where that discussion happens of here's some alternative ways that we can fix the issue. The other thing is the developer may find a couple false positives like I had talked about before. And at that point, you as security or you as the developer can present those false positives to the pen tester and potentially have them cleared. And then you as a security person should be on the call to make sure that there's consistency across how all of the applications are fixing this issue so that architecturally you're remaining consistent. So you're going to see a number of the same issues, and you may, that's another reason why security should be on the call is as you see those issues happening across multiple applications, you may want to take that as a security initiative and roll that out as a security effort across all applications. And then the other thing is that, if you've seen the same issue in another application, the developer doesn't know how to fix it, you can provide guidance on how that other team fixed it and maybe refer them to the developer who did fix the issue. So you can help maintain consistency and help the developer fix the issues. And this is the thing that I'm really, really passionate about, is to make sure that you're not making the developers responsible for fixing those issues. So after the closeout call, and this is where I went off earlier, after the closeout call, the developer should be out of it. And you should then take that report to the product manager, to the application owner, whoever it may be that allocates the developer's time, and put it in the backlog or the issue tracking system. And have, essentially security becomes a non-functional requirement. So put that in the backlog and in the issue tracking system and make sure it's prioritized. Because you may give it to the developer and the developer may say he fixes it, he'll fix it, and he's going to want to fix it. But understand that 45 to 50 hours of his time a week has already been allocated to what is probably functionality issues. So if he really does fix those issues, he's taking his personal time to fix those issues. It's really important that we make the product owner responsible for these issues and deal with them and make sure that it's prioritized appropriately. Many of you said that your applications are provided to, are used by clients or contain client-sensitive information. So I've been on the other side. I've done vendor assessments a large amount of time, and I've also been the recipient of a number of vendor assessments. And I think the way that organizations are responding to vendor assessments is detrimental to their own organization. And as you know, when I was a vendor assessor, I would ask for the world and settle on something much lower than that. So number one is don't be afraid or intimidated when one of your clients asks for something. We're all in this together, and I think most of the time they understand it. They may be taking a tough stance, but they're willing to compromise. Do not ever, ever, ever allow your clients to pen test your applications. If they need to pen test the application and they have their own vendor, you can enter into an agreement with that vendor, and you are the customer to that pen testing, or you are the client to that pen testing vendor, but don't ever let the client pay the bill for a pen test. Because think about it, if you've got Coke and Pepsi as a vendor or as a client, and they're both using your application, and Coke comes in and pen tests the application, what if they get horizontal privilege escalation within that application and can now see Pepsi's data? And how would you feel as Pepsi knowing that Coke has done a pen test on your application? And even if they didn't get horizontal privilege escalation, they now know the vulnerabilities of your application. So on the same note, don't ever share a detailed report with your clients. Typically what we would do is have a letter that says here's the qualifications of the vendor performing the assessment, here's the scope of that assessment, and here's the methodology we used in doing that assessment. And then at the end of the day, we found 1 high-risk issue and 2 medium-risk issues, and that's about it. Now they may push, so that's going to be acceptable to at least 70% of your clients. So if they want more, then maybe you can have a phone call with them and say, hey, we found 2 cross-site scripting issues and 1 unvalidated redirect. And we're going to have this issue fixed in 2 months. This was not, the cross-site scripting was not widespread. It was in very point instances, and maybe it was just an error message. And that will probably cover 99% of your vendors there. And then for those last ones that continue to press to see the pen testing report, and oftentimes this is going to be your banks, they have funding to do this too, and oftentimes they're probably going on site to review your data center anyway. Tell them you can come on site and look at the detailed pen test report, but no pictures, no notes, you're not taking it out of the room, and I'm going to be looking over your shoulder while you look at it. And that should be the absolute furthest you ever go in disclosing your pen test reports to your vendors. And then when they ask you to fix those security issues, just like I told you with your development organization, treat them as non-functional defects. And they should be prioritized, and this is probably outlined in the contract how they deal with those. They may define security issues separately, but make sure you're abiding by the contract, but prioritize those issues. You don't need to fix those right away. So the last thing that I'm going to go into is working with pen testing organizations. I see so many organizations treat their pen testers like the enemy, like they need to get one over on them. And I absolutely think that's the wrong approach. You need to partner with your pen testers. If you start ignoring their emails during the course of a pen test and it takes you 2 days to get back on their emails, your pen testers may be sitting there for 2 days doing nothing. So you're losing coverage. And the next time they scope a pen test, instead of scoping it 2 weeks, they're going to say we need 3 weeks because you're not responding to our emails. And they won't tell you that. They're just going to scope it at 3 weeks and you're going to pay more. Whereas the organization that is treats every email from their pen tester as something that needs to be dealt with right away because they're paying $250 an hour while that pen tester waits, maybe next time they're going to get scoped at a week and a half for that engagement. And if you work well with your pen testers and they like you, they're going to do a better job, and they may even give you strategy and consulting advice that can make your project or your program better. And then I think I had alluded to this before, and I always get crap for, I had to do the horse thing because I always get crap for calling it a stable of pen testers. Have at least 3 pen testing organizations in your stable. Because number one, they may have differing specialties. I have one team that's very experienced developers, and they do great at white box pen testing. If I give them the source code, so it's our own internally built application, they can really tear it apart. They don't do as well at black box. And then I have another organization that are hackers in the purest sense of the word. They like to tear stuff apart. They like to explore things. So I give them my COTS applications, or those things where I can't give them the source code. So I can use them to their differing strength. They may have differing engagement models. They may have, so one of them may need 8 weeks lead time, where I've got one organization, if I give them a signed statement of work, user credentials, and a URL on Friday, they can start testing on Monday. And likewise, if I cancel on Friday, it doesn't matter, because they have pen tests that they can just kind of do whenever they want, and they don't have people sitting on the bench for it. So use those models to your advantage. And then lastly, it provides you a backup. What if you rely on one pen tester, what if they get a ton of work and they don't have time to slot you in? Well, you've got a backup plan. What if they really screw up and you have to fire them? Then you're left in a lurch. So that's really all I have. I think I have a couple minutes for questions if you have any questions. Also, you can tweet me or email me with any questions, and I'll be around afterwards too. But does anyone have any questions here? Yes. Burp Proxy is your best bet. That's a manual pen testing tool. I recommend the Web Application Hacker's Handbook to dig into all of that stuff. It's about $30, but it's an invaluable reference that I think even experienced pen testers continue to refer to. Web Application Hacker's Handbook. No problem. Yes. I didn't go into the automated, I kind of left the automated testing out of the scope of this discussion, but I have dealt with static analysis tools if you want to talk about it afterwards. Any other questions? All right, thank you all.